It's amazing to see that project actually on such a special building from that period in time. And we're going to talk now about buildings which are possibly a little bit less special than that one. I was reading a book this week, Jane Merkel's brilliant book about Eero Saarinen, just reminded me about time and talking. And Eero was making a presentation to a client, and Eero had a very slow, monotone delivery, and the client had the temerity to stop him during the presentation and saying, "Mr. Saarinen, you're speaking very slowly. Could you speak somewhat faster?" And he said, "No, but I can say less." So I'm going to, with that spirit in mind, I'm going to try and say a little bit less here. This is a project that we started in the office a number of years ago, and it was probably anticipating things that we were seeing in other parts of the world in terms of offices that were of a certain age in the 60s and 70s becoming somewhat stranded assets, which is sort of a buzzword, if you like, at the moment. And we anticipated that that might happen to a slightly lesser degree in Ireland. And it's set against the context of, obviously, number one, housing being our kind of number one issue, as well as sustainability. And the second issue, of course, being with regard to offices, that they're falling in value quite quickly. And there's a major sustainability question about what we're going to do with these really quite simple structures from the 60s and 70s and 80s. Refurbishing them, of course, is a great idea, but there are unavoidable, sort of get-overable problems to do with that as well, which are largely to do with the floor-to-ceiling heights in these buildings. They're sort of tight structural grids. They're made for that image in the bottom left. Any fans of Mad Men will recognise the offices of Sterling Cooper, sort of the steno pool of clerical workers in the middle of the floor plan, and then executive offices on the outside. And there's no organisations that work like that anymore. So we started to look at sort of grade C and grade B offices in our city centres from the point of view of figuring out, well, what could be done with them. And in Ireland, of course, this is a very mixed bag of properties. You get fabulous buildings like the Central Bank, but lots of those buildings really are less about being pieces of architecture than they are about being kind of bottom lines on the balance sheets of pension funds and things like that. But we're kind of stuck with them now, and we can't kind of act in a climate profligate way to kind of just take them down. So we start to imagine what could happen to them. And increasingly, as I say, it's becoming more impossible to take them down, and it's great to see councils, Dublin City Council particularly, taking a strong line on this. But some of these buildings, because of their particular characteristics, are getting into a stage where you can't actually let the building if you own it. It's not viable to refurbish it. It's definitely not viable to redevelop it because they're on quite small sites. And increasingly, it's impossible to demolish them. So, I mean, where do we go? Now, we've always thought that there was great opportunity for residential adaptive reuse for these buildings. And in contrast to buildings where this is happening in the States, for example, our buildings here are shorter, simpler, more narrow. They're made of concrete. They're in many ways much more receptive to change than some of the examples you might see in places like Calgary and so on. But the number one rule is, of course, location, location, location. I mean, these buildings are in places where you would absolutely kill to have residential quantum. And within that, of course, our planning regulations allow us to change within the zoning. It's still a planning application. We don't have permitted development like they have in the UK, for instance. And of course, those very things like limited floor-to-ceiling heights, which don't allow these buildings to be changed into grade A office space. If you delivered that kind of quantum as residential, you'd be having market-leading residential space. They're like loft spaces that you would have in London or Manhattan. So looking at what kind of buildings are suitable, what are good economic candidates, the real sort of rule that we found was that the crapper the building was for conversion into grade A space, the better it was for residential. And I think the really interesting thing about these buildings is that in the same way as we make commercial buildings today, which are BCO compliant and they're all basically the same, those buildings were all exactly the same. And I mean, here's three examples. Harcourt Street, a really horrible building on a fantastic site on the way into the Ivy Gardens, Wicklow Castle House, Telephone House, all grids of 8 metres by 5 metres by about 5.5 metres, all built in the same way, a central offset corridor, and made of concrete, effectively bulletproof, with an escape stair at one end and a court at the other end. And if you're a developer working in the 60s, 70s or 80s, that was your sort of genesis point for making a building that would make a lot of money on the bottom line. So, sort of inspired by some of the work in the US, we came up with a scoring system for these buildings that would be based on things like structure, services, grid dimensions, and so on. And we started to assess buildings across the city in terms of their viability for conversion into different types of residential. But you do come up against a kind of fundamental issue on these buildings, which is that when people try and lay them out on the second diagram on the left-hand side there, you do tend to end up with buildings that are single aspect, or with units that are single aspect, that don't go around corners very well. They tend to absorb all the facades, so it's not a very economical proposal. So we need to kind of think of a different way of occupying these buildings, you know, working with the kind of grain of their grid dimensions and their floor-to-ceiling heights. And we always had in our minds, I suppose, being architects, the kind of, you need to say, because of course that section is of a very, very similar dimension to some of the office buildings that we're talking about. And by absolutely beautiful serendipitous chance, if you start to inhabit some of those office buildings working with those existing grids and working them with this sort of duplex section, you end up with a two-bed apartment which is absolutely bang on the correct size for our national guidance, just by absolutely glorious chance. And not only is that a very nice way to occupy a building, it also economically makes a lot of sense because you've jumped from an efficiency of about 85% on alternate floors to about 96%. So you're actually occupying the building in a really economic, really kind of highly efficient way. So I mean, we sort of gamed this up, if you like, with that format of development. And in a fairly insubstantial place, like a small office building on Lower Mount Street, one of the most horrible streets, unfortunately, in Dublin, that used to be absolutely full of people and full of life. And from the 1960s forward has just been eroded to the point where you can kind of watch the tumbleweeds going down it. Howl at the Moon isn't even there anymore. There's nothing that happens. So to be able to take a building like that, which is a fairly standard 60s monster, re-inhabit it and bring 127 residential units in predominantly a two-bed dual aspect format back into the building and do it in an economic and viable way. And not only that, to bring the life back to the street. And we always think, because we're kind of architects and we think like this, wouldn't it be absolutely beautifully poetic if those very buildings which chased all the people out of living in that part of the city were the very armatures that brought them back into it? Thank you very much.